The Darksiders franchise has always been one of constant reinvention, beginning as a solid action game with entertaining puzzles before adding a Diablo-esque loot system in Darksiders 2 and poorly aping Dark Souls with its third outing. The latest game in the series, Darksiders Genesis, looks to take things back a couple of steps, even if at first glance it looks wildly out of place. Don't let the game's pulled-out top-down camera fool you. Darksiders Genesis feels much closer to the pre-THQ Nordic entries in the series, leaving 3's punishing Souls-like approach to combat in the dust in favour of returning to a faster-paced hack-and-slash style. Encounters are usually centered around dealing with large groups of enemies, and as the Horseman war, you have a decent range of combos and meter-burning powers to throw at them. You also have an entire second character to play around with, Strife, the final horseman for fans of the series to get their hands on. While Strife can easily be played in a similar style to War by chaining light and heavy attacks together in conjunction with the odd well-timed dodge, that would be doing a disservice to his role in the game. Strife features a twin-stick shooter mechanic that's entirely unique to him, allowing players to unload on enemies at a distance, all while building up a heat meter which empowers his guns. This can take the form of a faster rate of fire, automatically charged shots, or beams that can penetrate multiple enemies at once, depending on the ammo type being used at the time. Being able to switch freely between the close-range, crowd control favouring War and the faster, range-capable Strife makes for a fun experience that manages to stay fresh despite the game's combat-heavy focus. No matter who you're playing as, the action is well-paced, mindless fun, and it's easily the game's strength. On top of adding a second playable character to the mix, Darksiders Genesis also lets you bring an additional player along for the ride as well. Since much of the game relies on combat encounters, having a buddy along for the adventure can make for some potentially chaotic fun, though I did have some issues with the online matchmaking. More specifically, setting my game to friends only didn't manage to stop anyone from joining, regardless of their status on my friends list, and anytime I did play with someone online, the game's performance tanked pretty badly. More on that later. Also, the game's local co-op only allows new players to join or drop out at specific points, which is a weird, if mostly innocuous choice. Now, for as cool as being able to play with a friend is, I did find myself playing most of Darksiders Genesis solo, simply because the game's puzzles usually require the skills and tools of one character or the other, and it's way easier to flip between the two rather than communicating with a buddy, especially over Nintendo's online service. I will say that the game's alteration of solo puzzles for co-op play is appreciated, even if I'd find them infuriating in anything other than local play. Outside of communication issues regarding network play and puzzle solving, I found the game's return to tool-based puzzles to be rather refreshing, especially after Darksiders 3 and its lock and key approach to progression. Sure, Darksiders Genesis still blocks you from entering areas that you haven't got the required tool to pass, but when it comes to actually using these tools, you have to use your brain a bit. Admittedly, there aren't a ton of challenging puzzles in the bunch, but there's enough here to offset the mindless combat, and occasionally the game tasks you with combining toolsets in really neat ways. For instance, you might need to hit an out-of-reach target with War's boomerang, forcing you to combine it with Strife's portal grenades or something. Having to use different tools in tandem with one another is definitely the coolest part of the game's approach to puzzles, and it's bolstered by having a decent number of tools on offer throughout the game's runtime. There aren't enough to have you feeling overwhelmed by any means, but there are enough to keep it from getting old quickly. That's not to say that certain aspects of Darksiders Genesis don't wear thin early on. For starters, its fairly basic platforming can feel cumbersome thanks to the new camera angle. This new point of view had me leaping off of walls in every direction except the one that I actually meant to go, because the game would interpret aiming upwards as aiming along a ledge, for instance. On top of that, a large part of the game's progression system requires you to fill an upgrade tree with relevant enemy cores, which are earned as random drops from killing the enemies in question. It's a fine system, but if you're looking to upgrade each one completely, you're looking at killing a lot of the same enemy to continue collecting these cores. Thankfully, the game isn't particularly difficult, so leveling up these cores and making your character as strong as possible isn't really necessary. By the 4th or 5th level, my War and Strife were twice as powerful as the recommended level, and I really only had trouble with one of the later boss fights. Speaking of, the boss fights in Darksiders Genesis just aren't particularly inspired. For the most part, they're just damage sponges that throw the odd wave of additional minions at you so you can keep your health topped up. Occasionally they'll introduce a neat gimmick like summoning artifacts that introduce further complications into the fight or activating crystals that buff the boss's attack and defense, but for the most part they're pretty straightforward. Thankfully they look way cooler than they're implemented, so there's that at least. But then, striking visuals have never really been an issue for the Darksiders franchise, and Darksiders Genesis is no different. The Joe Mad style of characters looking over-designed in the best possible way is on full display here despite the game's smaller scale. Its animatics and character dialogue art are both awesome, though the game's graphical quality does leave a little something to be desired, on the Switch at least. With the camera angle being what it is, you don't get a great look at the action at the best of times, which is a shame considering how cool some of the game's animations look, I think. And for the most part, the game just doesn't look very crisp. Between rough-looking character models, textures that constantly pop in and out, and a frame rate that would hit single digits whenever I played in an online session, Darksiders Genesis is far from a technical masterpiece. The damn thing crashed on me like 3 times, thankfully doing so only as I launched levels, never while I was partway through them. The game's performance and visual shortcomings are a real shame too, because otherwise Genesis has the same high-quality sound design as its predecessors. It has a fittingly epic soundtrack and a voice cast filled with plenty of fantastic performances from series veterans and newcomers alike, from Liam O'Brien and Phil Lamar to Keith freaking David. Unfortunately, the story that Darksiders Genesis is trying to tell with these great performances is one that doesn't really shed much light on anything that Darksiders fans didn't already know. It serves its purpose as a vehicle to introduce a handful of cool demon lords to us, as well as giving players some hints of things to come in the mainline Darksiders games, but that's about it. The story follows war and strife on a mission to stop Lucifer from upsetting the balance, long before the events of the original Darksiders, but the game kinda comes up short on its end, pitting you against Lucifer's lackeys while never letting you go head to head against the big dog himself. Aside from seeing the events that set the table for Darksiders 1 through 3, there just isn't a whole lot to get excited about here. While I found its value as a straight-up narrative rather lacking, Darksiders Genesis does offer plenty of side quests and additional content to sink your teeth into. It's not very compelling, but the combat and puzzles are enjoyable enough, and if you're looking for something to do while you listen to a podcast, for instance, you could do far worse. As far as I could tell, the only thing you get for playing all this extra content is currency of various flavors, which is all well and good if you want to power level your horsemen, but as I said earlier, that's not really necessary. With all that said, Darksiders Genesis is mediocre. On the whole, it's a perfectly solid action game with a smattering of neat puzzles to keep things fresh, though it won't be blowing any minds. Fans of the series might appreciate the game's nods to main series events as well as the returning cast of characters, but they're likely to be just as underwhelmed by the story as I was. Combine that with the disappointing lack of polish that Darksiders Genesis brings to the table, and I can't help but find it missing the mark. Not by a lot, but by enough.